On a winter's night in 1832, a farmer returning from market swore he saw something that chilled him deeper than the frost biting at his coat. In the pale light of the moon, two small figures stood at the edge of the parish graveyard, their hands joined, their heads inclined toward one another. He expected to hear childish chatter or cries, yet the air remained still. No words, no sound, only the sight of their shadows shifting as though whispering. The man froze, convinced that he was seeing an omen. The figures dissolved into the fog, leaving him shaken. He would later insist to his neighbors that their lips had not moved, though he was certain they had been speaking. It is from this chilling account that the story begins, the lives of two conjoined sisters born in a rural corner of Scotland, whose strange and secret conversations, conducted only in dreams, would leave behind one of the most unsettling mysteries of the 19th century. The year 1832 was not a kind year for Scotland. Across the countryside, families battled famine, outbreaks of cholera, and the deep unease of political change. In small parishes tucked between hills and moors, villagers clung to faith, superstition, and gossip as much as they clung to their meager livelihoods. It was in one of these forgotten hamlets, its cottages pressed against the weight of wind and damp stone, that the twins came into the world. Their birth was not a quiet or private affair. The midwives who attended the delivery whispered prayers between their instructions, crossing themselves more than once as the cries of the newborns filled the darkened room. What should have been two distinct voices merged into one wavering sound, as though echoing from a single throat. The mother, pale and trembling from the ordeal, asked weakly if her babies were alive. One midwife muttered that they were, though she added under her breath that God alone knew what had been sent into the household. The girls were joined at the side, their small bodies forever bound. At first glance they seemed frail, yet the longer one looked, the more uncanny details emerged. They blinked not in unison, but in alternating rhythm, as if each child's awareness was tethered to the other's. When one turned her head, the other seemed to follow after a heartbeat, like a delayed reflection. Neighbors who peeked through the doorframe that night carried away stories of unnatural synchronicity, though others insisted it was nothing more than the fearful exaggerations of tired eyes. But the silence, always the silence, was impossible to explain. For in their earliest months, the twins rarely cried. Mothers in the village often remarked that infants' voices could carry for miles, yet these children barely whined when hungry. Their mother, wrapped in both exhaustion and wonder, confessed that she sometimes forgot they were even in the room until she saw them staring, motionless, as though listening to something no one else could hear. It was not long before whispers spread through the parish. The year was heavy with talk of cholera, of spirits taking the weak before their time. To some villagers, the twins' quietness was a sign of mercy, they would not disturb their mother more than life already had. To others, it was proof of unnatural birth, of children half in this world and half beyond. Midwives refused to speak openly, yet one was heard to mutter at market that the girls had never properly drawn their first breath, that they lived only because something else was breathing for them. From the very beginning, these children became a canvas for fear, fascination, and folklore. No one could agree on what they represented. Were they simply a medical accident, another cruel trick of nature in an age where medicine rarely triumphed? Or were they, as some suggested in hushed voices, a judgment upon their family, a punishment made flesh? The parents, weary from poverty and shame, tried to protect their daughters from the eyes of the village. They kept the children close, wrapping them in blankets and carrying them together as though they were a single child. Yet secrecy was impossible. The parish was too small, the curiosity too strong. By the time the twins were a year old, everyone in the village knew of them. Few dared to speak directly to the family, but many watched for signs, for proof of strangeness. And signs did appear. The mother recalled waking one night to a faint murmur drifting through the cottage. At first she thought it was her husband speaking in his sleep, but when she turned, she found him silent beside her. The sound came instead from the cradle. She crept toward it and saw both twins lying still, their eyes closed, their mouths unmoving. Yet she swore she heard them whispering, soft, deliberate, in words she could not fully understand. She touched one of their foreheads, and at once the murmur stopped. Both children stirred, sighing in unison. This was the beginning of the claim that would define them, that the twins spoke to each other not in waking life, but only in dreams. Over time, the story of that night grew more vivid in retelling. Some claimed the mother herself became pale and gaunt, as if listening to things she could never repeat. Others insisted the father forbade her to mention it again, fearing the wrath of the church. Yet the rumor refused to die. By the time the children could toddle across the floor, villagers said they carried a secret world inside them, a world that surfaced only in sleep. The opening of their lives is a story of stillness and silence. In a time when the cries of children meant life and strength, these twins became known for the absence of sound, for whispers without breath, for shadows that seemed to converse when no words were spoken. And so their story begins as it would end, with silence, with secrecy, and with a candle that, once lit, would never burn twice. To understand the strange fate of the twins, one must first step into the land that shaped them. In the early decades of the 19th century, rural Scotland remained a place caught between survival and superstition. Fields stretched across moorland that could swallow a traveler in mist within minutes. Stone cottages leaned against one another as though seeking shelter, their thatched roofs damp and moss-covered. Narrow lanes, carved into the earth by cart wheels and endless rain, wound toward the parish kirk, the one structure that rose above the cottages like a stern guardian of the land. The parish was small, barely more than a scattering of families whose lives revolved around farming, prayer, and rumor. Most of the men toiled in fields or walked miles to market towns, their boots heavy with mud. Women bore the burden of both household and children, often with little more than faith to sustain them. Hunger was no stranger, nor was sickness. Cholera outbreaks could wipe out a family in days, leaving cottages empty except for the echo of grief. It was in this fragile environment, where every event was interpreted as divine blessing or divine punishment, that the twins were born. The family into which they arrived lived at the edge of the parish, near the moorland that locals called the Grey Margin. Their cottage was modest, with one room that served for cooking, sleeping, and living. Smoke seeped constantly from the hearth, darkening the beams overhead. Their father, a laborer with little land of his own, hired himself out during harvest seasons and returned with wages barely enough to feed his growing household. Their mother, pale and worn from repeated childbirth, had already buried 2 infants before the twins were born. Her neighbors often remarked that sorrow clung to her like a second shadow. The parish itself carried its own stories, whispered through generations. There were tales of drowned fields where the earth had swallowed entire flocks, of phantom bells heard from the sea on storm-tossed nights, and of dream bridges, mystical passages said to connect sleepers across distances. In a community where folklore and faith lived side by side, no story was too strange to believe, especially when misfortune constantly pressed against every threshold. To the villagers, the twins' uncanny silence was not merely a curiosity. It was evidence that the old tales still had weight, that the unseen world had not retreated from their lives. Religion provided both comfort and fear. The kirk minister, Reverend Alastair Hume, was a stern figure who ruled his congregation with sermons of fire and judgment. He was known to scold children in the street for laughing too loudly, to chastise women for idle chatter, and to thunder from the pulpit that God was watching every careless deed. His voice carried more authority than any landlord, and his influence shaped how the parish would view the strange children at its edge. Hume's theology left no room for wonder, it demanded obedience and suspicion of anything unexplainable. For him, miracles had ended with the apostles, and what lingered was deception. This strict atmosphere deepened the isolation of the family. While most villagers remained outwardly polite, few offered real friendship. Women exchanged bread or broth during hard winters but did not linger at the doorway. Men nodded greetings without stopping for conversation. All the while, glances followed the mother when she walked through the village with her bundled daughters. Curiosity gnawed at the community, yet fear held their tongues. Children dared each other to peek into the family's yard, only to run away shrieking when caught. What the villagers saw was a family living under constant shadow, bound not only by poverty but by the unease of their neighbors. Yet what the family experienced was more subtle, the sense that the very land seemed to press against them. Nights on the grey margin were long and oppressive. Fog rolled down from the hills, settling like a blanket against the cottage walls. The mother often said she felt as though the moor was listening, its silence heavier than any sound. Within this suffocating quiet, the twins' own silence became part of the landscape itself. The parish records from these years are sparse, written in ink that has faded into illegibility. Yet one entry remains, the note of their baptism. Reverend Hume reluctantly agreed to baptize the children, though he delivered a sermon that very day condemning unnatural births. He declared that the devil often sought to mock God's creation, twisting it into monstrous forms. Those present claimed the parents lowered their heads in shame, though their mother wept silently as holy water touched her daughters' foreheads. Baptism should have granted protection, but instead it sealed suspicion. From that day, the twins were branded not only as peculiar children but as a possible warning from God himself. As they grew older, their presence wove itself into the parish's identity. When storms destroyed crops, some muttered that it was because of the cursed children. When illnesses spread, neighbors glanced at the family's door as though contagion could be traced to it. And yet, when winter bit hardest, and food grew scarce, the same neighbors left offerings near the family's threshold, an odd mix of hostility and reluctant appeasement. They feared the twins, yet feared more what might happen if they showed cruelty too openly. Thus the parish became a stage for contradiction. Outwardly devout, inwardly haunted by superstition. Eager to condemn, yet reluctant to provoke. In such soil, the legend of the dream-speaking twins did not merely survive, it flourished. Their silence was interpreted not as absence but as presence, proof of another world brushing against their own. It was in this parish of shadows, with its stern kirk, whispered tales, and heavy silence, that the twins' story unfolded. Every lane, every pew, every cottage seemed to lean toward them, waiting, fearing, and listening. And in such a place, even the faintest murmur of a dream could grow into a haunting echo that no one would ever forget. The first years of the twins' lives passed under a veil of unease, though to the family themselves it was also a time of fragile tenderness. Their mother, despite the weight of whispers and the severity of Reverend Hume's sermons, clung fiercely to her daughters. She dressed them in garments stitched from a single cloth so that their bound bodies would appear less unusual, and she cradled them with a patience that neighbors would later describe as almost unnatural in its devotion. To her, they were not omens or curses. They were simply children, fragile, strange, yet hers. Still, there was no escaping the peculiarity that defined them. Most children babble within their first year, experimenting with sounds and laughter that fill a household with noise. But these twins remained largely mute. They would smile faintly, even giggle, but they rarely produced the long, incoherent babbling that mothers cherished as proof of healthy growth. Instead, they communicated with each other through looks and subtle movements. One child would tilt her head and the other would respond with a twitch of the hand. It was as if words were unnecessary, as though a silent current flowed between them that no outsider could touch. Visitors to the cottage found the quiet unsettling. Neighbors who came with soup or bread often returned uneasy, telling others that the children stared too directly, their eyes fixed not on the visitor but on each other. It was not hostility, but an absorption so complete that the outside world seemed irrelevant. One woman later told her sister that she tried to coax a smile by waving a toy, only to feel invisible, as if the twins inhabited a space that excluded everyone else. By the time they turned 3, their differences could no longer be ignored. Their parents noticed that when one twin dozed in the afternoon, the other would often fall into slumber within minutes. More than once their mother observed one stirring, lips fluttering with faint sounds while still asleep. At the same moment, the other twitched and sighed, as if responding. It was a rhythm that unsettled even their father, who muttered that children should not act in such ways. Their mother hushed him, though privately she began to fear what it meant. Outside the family, rumors grew. It was said that the girls never cried for food, never screamed in anger, and never squabbled as siblings were expected to. Children from neighboring cottages teased one another with dares, to sneak near the gray margin and see if the twins would blink at them. Some swore that when one of the girls lifted a hand, the other followed with a delay of several heartbeats, creating the impression of an echo rather than a mirrored gesture. What was natural coincidence to a mother appeared to others as unnatural coordination. The parish schoolmaster, a man fond of strict order, was persuaded to visit the cottage when the twins reached the age at which children should begin learning their letters. He sat with slate and chalk, asking them to repeat simple sounds. But the girls remained silent, gazing at one another with faint smiles. Frustrated, he rapped his stick against the hearthstone and demanded obedience. Still, no words came. He later told Reverend Hume that teaching them would be a waste of time, that their minds seemed fixed elsewhere. With that, the twins were excluded from the parish school, deepening their isolation. Yet despite their silence, they were not joyless. Their mother remembered moments of strange playfulness, the way they would press their foreheads together and giggle softly, or how they would tap one another's fingers in patterns like secret codes. They delighted in small objects, shiny buttons, feathers caught from the moor, fragments of colored glass. When given such treasures, they held them between their joined hands, as though ownership belonged not to one but to both. It was a life lived in quiet companionship, a bond too deep for outsiders to penetrate. But the nights told a different story. Their mother increasingly woke to faint noises, murmurs that seemed to drift from the cradle even when both children slept. Sometimes she heard what sounded like soft conversation, words overlapping in a strange cadence. Once, she shook them gently awake in alarm, only to find them staring at her with placid expressions, as though nothing had happened. Terrified, she confided in her husband, but he urged silence. Better to say nothing than to feed the gossip that already swirled around them. It was not long before neighbors began claiming to hear strange sounds as well. Passing by the cottage at dusk, some swore they caught faint murmuring, though the girls were unseen. Whether these were genuine experiences or the product of fearful imagination hardly mattered. The idea took root. The twins were whispering in dreams, sharing speech that the waking world could never capture. This belief turned their silence into something far more disturbing. Children who did not speak were pitied. But children who reserved their speech for another realm were regarded with suspicion. To the villagers, the twins' muteness in daylight became evidence that they belonged partly to another world. By the age of 5, they had become a subject of hushed speculation at market stalls and whispered prayers in pews. And yet, within the small circle of their home, they remained simply children, quiet, enigmatic, yet affectionate. Their mother rocked them to sleep as she did her other children, sang hymns softly when she thought no one could hear, and kissed their brows before bed. But she also prayed more fervently, asking God to protect them, or at least to spare them from becoming objects of hatred. She knew the parish well enough to understand that what began as whispers could harden into condemnation. Thus their silent childhood unfolded, a paradox of tenderness within the home and unease beyond its walls. To the world, they were children without voices. To each other, they were a language entire, spoken without breath, a bond hidden in dreams. And in this silence, the seeds of their mystery began to grow. By the time the twins reached 6 years of age, their strangeness could no longer be dismissed as a passing peculiarity of childhood. Their silence by day was unsettling enough, but what occurred by night began to rattle even the most skeptical neighbors. It was their mother who first began keeping account of the dreams. She said it began innocently, when the girls would wake in the morning and, without hesitation, recount their slumber in words that mirrored one another. They did not speak aloud but whispered to her with lips barely parted, voices faint and measured, as if drifting from the edge of sleep itself. What one began, the other would complete, describing the same dream with eerie precision. They spoke of landscapes unfamiliar to their mother, fields of white grass, rivers that ran upward into the sky, and a chapel whose doors were carved into the air but could never be opened. At first, she thought it charming, if peculiar. Children were known to share fantasies, and imagination often blurred the lines between truth and invention. But soon, she realized that their dream accounts were not merely similar, they were identical. One morning, the elder by a matter of minutes described walking across a hall paved with mirrors. Without prompting, the other added, and the mirrors did not show us. Their mother fell silent, the hair on her arms prickling. She began to test them, asking questions about what they had seen. How many steps in the mirrored hall? What color were the candles burning in the chapel? Each time, their answers matched, down to the most obscure detail. The precision was uncanny, far beyond what she could attribute to coincidence. Inevitably, the villagers learned of these dreams. It happened when a cousin visited from a neighboring parish and overheard the girls murmuring in the morning. Alarmed, she carried word back to her own household. Within weeks, the tale spread that the conjoined sisters did not speak to the world but conversed freely in the realm of dreams. In a community where stories traveled faster than truth, this rumor took root and grew monstrous. Whispers turned to curiosity. A neighbor approached the parents with a strange request: could he ask the girls questions as they dreamed? Reluctantly, and fearful of drawing more suspicion by refusing, the mother allowed it. He posed simple inquiries: what lay inside his locked chest at home, or what color coat he planned to wear at Sunday service. Days later, when the girls awoke, they recounted details with startling accuracy. They spoke of a red garment folded neatly inside a chest that the man admitted had not been opened in months. When he demanded to know how they could possibly have known, the twins only smiled faintly and leaned into each other. The story spread with new vigor. Some dismissed it as trickery, claiming the parents must have revealed the details in advance. Others whispered that the girls were touched by forces not of this world. The imagery of their dreams became the substance of gossip, repeated with embellishment until every villager seemed to know of the doorless church and the river without water. To the faithful, such visions smacked of unholy invention. To the fearful, they carried the weight of prophecy. As the years passed, their dream accounts grew darker. They described standing in fields where shadows moved though no figures cast them, or walking down roads that ended in walls of smoke. Once, they told of lying side by side in a coffin too small to contain them both, yet feeling no fear, only calm acceptance. Their mother wept at the telling, but the girls seemed untroubled, as if these visions were natural to them. Night after night, the murmurs continued. The family tried to conceal it, but thin cottage walls could not keep secrets. Neighbors claimed to hear voices drifting into the dark, though no lips moved. Some swore they passed by the window and saw the twins lying motionless, eyes closed, even as whispers filled the air. Whether imagination fed these claims or whether something real stirred, the parish was already convinced: the children spoke in dreams, and only in dreams. Inevitably, the kirk became involved. Reverend Hume thundered from his pulpit that Satan worked through sleep, tempting the vulnerable with visions that mimicked reality. He warned his flock not to indulge curiosity about the twins' dreams, declaring such tales blasphemy. But as often happens, his condemnation only heightened intrigue. For if the minister feared the dreams, did that not suggest their power was real? The children themselves seemed oblivious to the turmoil they caused. To them, dreaming was not an escape but a second life. Their mother described how they would wake smiling, eager to tell her what they had seen, as though returning from a visit to a place more vivid than their own. When scolded for speaking too freely, they would grow confused, unable to understand why their gift was regarded with suspicion. But what troubled their parents most were the dreams that seemed to foretell. One autumn, the girls spoke of a neighbor's child wandering into a river and vanishing beneath the water. Days later, that very boy drowned after slipping from a wet bank. Another time, they described a horse kicking a farmer in the chest, sending him to the ground. Within a week, the accident occurred almost exactly as they had said. Coincidence could explain some of it, but not all. Each new fulfillment sharpened the line between disbelief and terror. Those who had mocked the family now crossed the road to avoid them. Others began to leave small offerings at their door: bread, coins, scraps of cloth, as though seeking favor from forces that frightened them. The family lived in a state of contradiction, shunned by day, yet quietly appeased by night. Thus the twins' dreams, once innocent and peculiar, became prophecy and curse. Their whispers grew into the heartbeat of the parish itself, unsettling the faithful, haunting the fearful, and binding the sisters ever more tightly together. Theirs was a world divided, silent days, murmuring nights. And though no one yet dared admit it aloud, a question pressed into every mind: if these children could walk together through dreams, where else might they lead? By the year 1839, the parish could no longer ignore the twins. Their presence, once confined to rumor and hushed speculation, had become a matter of public conscience. Too many strange dreams had been recounted, too many coincidences whispered about in cottages and fields. The story of the drowned boy, the horse that struck its master, and other uncanny predictions weighed heavily upon the community. Curiosity had turned to unease, unease into dread. In such an atmosphere, the Kirk minister, Reverend Alastair Hume, stepped forward to bring judgment. Hume was not a man of compromise. Tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to burn from beneath heavy brows, he carried himself with the certainty of divine authority. For years he had thundered from the pulpit that sin lurked in every shadow, that the devil prowled behind every misfortune. To him, the mysterious behavior of the twins was not a puzzle to be studied but an abomination to be condemned. He declared it openly one Sabbath morning, raising his voice above the wind that rattled the kirk windows. These children, he proclaimed, are not blessed with secret knowledge but cursed with false tongues. Their dreams are snares, their whispers temptations. God does not speak through such mouths. The congregation sat frozen, caught between fear of the minister and fear of the story he condemned. Some shifted uncomfortably in their pews, unwilling to meet the eyes of their neighbors. Others nodded vigorously, grateful for the clarity of denunciation. The twins' parents, seated at the back, lowered their heads. Their mother clutched her shawl tighter, while their father stared at the floor, jaw clenched, knowing there would be no defense against such words. After that sermon, the tone of the village hardened. Where once neighbors had offered small kindnesses, a loaf of bread, a nod of sympathy, they now withdrew. Children were forbidden to visit the cottage at the grey margin. Women who had once exchanged gossip with the twins' mother now crossed themselves when she passed. The family was marked, isolated, condemned not by deed but by the weight of whispered suspicion and the minister's stern decree. Yet silence could not smother the truth. Though Reverend Hume insisted that the girls' dreams were the devil's work, villagers could not shake their fascination. In secret, some still listened when the girls spoke of their nightly wanderings. A farmhand, braver than most, crept to the cottage one night and pressed his ear to the shuttered window. He swore he heard two voices murmuring in rhythm, like a chant. But when he peered inside, both girls lay motionless, their mouths closed. Terrified, he fled, spreading the tale by morning. To the minister, this was proof of wickedness. To the villagers, it was proof of power. The minister's influence, however, could not be questioned. He summoned the parents to the kirk, rebuking them in private for failing to discipline their children. He demanded they silence the dream talk, forbid the girls from recounting what they saw. The father promised obedience, but his wife wept, insisting her daughters meant no harm. Hume's response was merciless: every sin begins with what seems harmless. He threatened to excommunicate the family should they continue to indulge the phantoms of night. From then on, the parents lived under a regime of fear. At meals, the father warned the children not to speak of dreams. He raised his voice in ways he never had before, desperate to avoid the kirk's wrath. But the girls could not stop. In their innocence, they continued to share their visions upon waking, though they lowered their voices, speaking only when their mother was near. The more they were forbidden, the more the dreams seemed to press upon them, urgent and inescapable. The minister's sermons grew increasingly fiery. He told his flock that the devil disguised himself in gentle forms, that Satan could creep into the cradle as easily as into the tavern. He urged the villagers to resist temptation, to turn away from the twin tongues of deceit. And yet, beneath the fear he sowed, something else stirred: resentment. For while Hume preached of danger, he offered no comfort. He gave his congregation rules and warnings but no relief from the unease that had already taken root. Within the parish, tension deepened. Some villagers whispered that the minister was too harsh, that the children were innocent victims. Others insisted the family had brought this curse upon themselves. Divisions grew, invisible yet sharp. Families who once worked side by side at harvest now eyed each other with suspicion. The twins, without speaking a single waking word, had become the fulcrum upon which the parish tilted between faith and fear. For the girls themselves, the rebuke had a profound effect. Their once gentle dream accounts became less playful, more secretive. Their mother noticed they no longer smiled when waking but looked troubled, even anxious, as if carrying burdens they could not share. At night, their murmuring grew more insistent. The rhythm of their sleep speech, once calm, became hurried and overlapping, like arguments carried out in silence. She lay awake listening, heart pounding, torn between waking them and letting the whispers fade into the dark. The rebuke of Reverend Hume did not silence the twins. It only forced their mystery deeper into shadow, where fear magnified every whisper, every glance, every silence. In trying to smother their voices, he had ensured they would never be forgotten. The parish, bound in suspicion and secrecy, began to unravel, not with loud confrontation, but with quiet dread that crept from cottage to cottage like smoke from a smoldering fire. After Reverend Hume's condemnation, silence became the family's only defense. The parents forbade the girls from recounting their dreams in public, and they avoided speaking of them even within their own home. Yet repression could not halt what unfolded. Indeed, the secrecy seemed to give the dreams a new intensity, as though the sisters' bond deepened in defiance of the world's attempts to stifle it. By the time the twins reached 8 years of age, their nights had grown restless. Neighbors who passed the cottage after dusk swore they heard strange murmurings carried on the wind. The sounds rose and fell, sometimes lilting like song, sometimes harsh and hurried, as though voices argued just beyond the walls. Yet when those bold enough pressed an ear against the timber, the cottage was still, the family sleeping in silence. These contradictions only fueled the sense that something unseen governed the sisters' lives. Their mother, lying awake through countless nights, became the most tormented witness. She described hearing her daughters speak in their sleep with voices that did not belong to children. Sometimes the tone was gentle, almost soothing, as if they comforted one another. At other times, the murmurs grew sharp and rhythmic, like commands. Once, she woke to find one child sitting upright, eyes closed, lips barely parting, while the other twitched beside her as though listening. When she shook them, both fell limp at once, breathing heavily, their faces pale as though drained. The content of their dreams grew more troubling. The girls began to whisper of deaths before they occurred. One winter, they told of a shepherd found frozen on the moor, describing his posture, the tilt of his head, the position of his hands. Days later, he was discovered exactly as they had said. Another time, they murmured of a cottage roof collapsing in a storm. Before the week ended, lightning struck a chimney, bringing the stones down upon the hearth. These accounts spread quickly, carried from ear to ear until the entire parish braced itself whenever the twins whispered of calamity. The line between rumor and reality blurred. Villagers who disliked the family insisted the girls caused the misfortunes, that their dreams invited darkness. Others, fearful yet unwilling to condemn them outright, began to leave offerings at their door, bread, milk, coins wrapped in cloth. By day the family was avoided, but by night their threshold became a shrine to ward off disaster. The paradox of being shunned and worshipped in equal measure wore heavily upon the parents, who longed for ordinary lives and instead found themselves custodians of dread. For the twins, the escalation took a visible toll. They no longer woke with gentle smiles but with weary, troubled expressions. Their eyes appeared ringed with shadow, their small bodies frilier with each passing month. Their mother noticed that when one coughed or winced in pain, the other reacted instantly, as if their suffering was fused. More than once she feared they would not survive the winter. Yet every dawn they awoke again, whispering softly, describing visions too vivid to dismiss. The parish could not escape the tension. Farmers spoke in low voices at the tavern, wondering whether the twins were prophets or demons. Women clutched their rosaries tighter, muttering prayers when they saw the family walk past. Even the kirk itself seemed uneasy. Reverend Hume thundered repeatedly that the devil worked most cruelly through children, but his vehemence betrayed his fear. Each denunciation drove curiosity deeper underground. Parishioners who condemned the twins by day still listened for their dreams by night, desperate for warnings of the future. As the years passed, the visions shifted. The girls began to speak of landscapes unlike anything known to the parish, forests without leaves, rivers that flowed in circles, skies that bent inward as though collapsing. Their words unsettled even those who sought prophecy, for these visions offered no guidance, only dread. Their mother tried to hush them, covering their mouths gently when they began to murmur. Yet even muffled, the whispers seemed to seep into the room, filling the air like smoke. The emotional strain within the cottage grew unbearable. The father, weary of suspicion and fearful of ruin, sometimes struck the table in frustration, demanding the girls be silent. But they could not. The bond that joined them seemed stronger than any command. Their mother, torn between fear and compassion, wept silently at night, praying for mercy that never came. She loved her daughters, yet the weight of their mystery pressed upon her like a stone she could not lift. Outside, villagers began to tell new tales. Some claimed the twins could summon storms. Others said they had seen strange lights above the cottage at night. Each story, whether true or born of fear, magnified the sense that the parish lived under a shadow cast not by the moor or the kirk, but by two frail children bound together in sleep. And still the nights escalated. The night had become their dominion, and within it, the line between dream and reality continued to thin. The rumors that swirled through the parish could not remain contained forever. By the late 1830s, whispers of the twins' nocturnal visions began reaching ears beyond the moors. Traders carried stories to neighboring towns, embellishing them with each retelling. In time, the accounts reached Edinburgh, where physicians and scholars, already fascinated by the mysteries of the mind, debated whether such children might provide evidence for hidden faculties of the human brain. It was the age of phrenology and mesmerism, when men in black coats believed that the shape of the skull could reveal character, and that unseen currents might link one mind to another. The tale of two conjoined sisters who spoke only in dreams seemed too perfect a specimen to ignore. Letters were exchanged, and soon inquiries made their way back to the parish. The first to arrive was Dr. William Carstairs, a physician known less for his cures than for his curiosity. He came bearing notebooks, brass instruments, and the solemn conviction that he could separate superstition from science. His presence unsettled the villagers. They watched him march the winding lanes, his boots muddied, his spectacles glinting, as if he were dissecting the land with his eyes. When Carstairs knocked upon the cottage door, the parents hesitated. To admit him was to expose their daughters further, yet to refuse risked offending men of authority. Reluctantly, they allowed him inside. He studied the girls by lamplight, circling them slowly as though they were specimens pinned beneath glass. He measured the circumference of their skulls, traced the ridge of bone that joined them, and tapped gently with the rounded end of his instrument, muttering notes under his breath. He asked questions in a soft but insistent voice. What did they dream? How did they know of deaths before they occurred? Did they hear voices, or did they see visions? The girls gave answers that were both simple and confounding. We only sleep, one said, and when we wake, we know. The other added, sometimes we speak, but we do not remember the words. Carstairs grew animated, declaring that this might prove the existence of shared consciousness. He scribbled furiously in his journal, noting the possibility that the sisters' brains, joined in ways unseen, produced simultaneous visions. He spoke of sympathy of nerves, of hidden pathways of thought. Yet even as he theorized, he failed to disguise his unease. When the girls fell silent and stared at him with their pale, unwavering gaze, he shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his collar as though the air had grown stifling. The villagers, curious but fearful, gathered outside. They whispered that the doctor's meddling would only stir the devil further. Some crossed themselves as they passed. Others lingered, hoping to overhear fragments of revelation. At the tavern that evening, Carstairs insisted to the men assembled that the girls were not witches, but marvels of nature. He claimed their visions were merely exaggerated dreams, perhaps heightened by their peculiar bond. Still, when asked why those dreams so often came true, his explanations faltered. Months later, another visitor arrived, Professor Archibald Lennox, a lecturer from Edinburgh with a keen interest in mesmerism. Unlike Carstairs, Lennox brought not only notebooks but an entourage of assistants. He requested permission to observe the girls over several nights. With pressure mounting, the parents reluctantly consented once more, though their faces bore the exhaustion of those forced into a cruel spectacle. The sessions were meticulous and unsettling. Lennox dimmed the lamps, placed pendulums before the children, and urged them into deeper states of sleep. He recorded every murmur, every twitch, every shift of breath. The twins complied with eerie calm, slipping into their whispers as though the stranger's presence mattered little. At one point, both spoke simultaneously in tones so low that the assistants leaned forward, straining to catch the words. Later, Lennox admitted he could not recognize the language, though he described it as rhythmic, almost liturgical. The parish reeled with rumor. Some claimed the professor had uncovered proof of communion with spirits. Others insisted he was merely another man deceived by children's tricks. But those who lived nearest the cottage swore the dreams grew sharper after his visit, as though probing eyes had only strengthened the twins' gift. Within weeks, more deaths and misfortunes were foretold, each aligning too closely with reality to dismiss. Lennox returned to Edinburgh, publishing a paper that skirted between science and sensationalism. He called the girls, a living testimony to the hidden corridors of the mind. The report drew further attention. Clergymen debated it from pulpits, warning against men who confused devilry with science. Meanwhile, curious gentlemen from afar began writing letters, asking whether the sisters might be brought to London for study. The very thought horrified their parents, who vowed never to subject the children to public exhibition. Yet the pressure mounted, as science, faith, and spectacle collided in their humble parish. In truth, neither Carstairs nor Lennox could resolve the mystery. Their instruments measured, their pens described, but the essence of the vision slipped beyond their reach. They departed with theories, but the family remained with the burden. For each visitor who left with excitement, the parents were left with deeper fear, knowing that their daughters' lives had become the subject of arguments carried far beyond the moors. The villagers, too, were left torn. Some took pride that their remote parish had become the focus of learned men. Others recoiled at the intrusion, convinced that nothing good could come from scholars meddling with forces best left untouched. For the twins themselves, the visits brought little change. They continued to whisper in their sleep, their fragile bodies weakening, their eyes growing more haunted each day. What men called research was to them simply the continuation of a fate they could not escape. And so the scientific eyes arrived, measured, and departed, leaving behind not clarity but a deeper shadow. The dreams continued. The villagers remained restless. And the sisters, caught between worlds, grew into a living paradox, too fragile to endure constant scrutiny, yet too strange to be ignored. The years following the visits from doctors and professors left the family more fractured than whole. Their cottage, once a humble shelter against the winds of the moors, became a fortress of silence. Curtains remained drawn, visitors discouraged. The parents, wearied by constant intrusion, no longer trusted the outside world. Even the villagers, once eager to gossip, began keeping their distance. Fear and fatigue had driven a wedge between the twins' family and the parish that had raised them. The girls themselves grew increasingly frail. Their bodies, already bound in a shared struggle for survival, seemed weakened by the endless strain of their visions. Their skin grew pale, their eyes hollow. They spent long hours confined to their bed, whispering to each other in a twilight half-sleep that unnerved their mother. Sometimes she would shake them awake, fearing that they might drift so far into their shared dream world that they would never return. What troubled her most was the change in their manner. As small children, they had clung to her, laughing despite their strange condition. Now, as they entered adolescence, a darker stillness overtook them. They no longer ran fingers through her hair or asked childish questions about the fields and seasons. Instead, they spoke rarely while awake, and when they did, their voices were flat, as though drained of warmth. Their only moments of animation came in sleep, when their bodies stirred with whispers, murmurs, and sometimes sudden cries that echoed like prayers torn apart. The father grew bitter with each passing year. He resented the scholars who had intruded, and he cursed the neighbors who muttered prayers as they passed his gate. In tavern corners, he was known to drink more than he could afford, railing against both the church and the city men. They look at them like curiosities, he spat, but they will not live the lives for them. It is we who pay the cost. His anger frightened his wife, who bore the silence of suffering with more resignation, yet even she could not mask the dread that hung over the household. The turning point came one winter night, when the twins dreamt of a fire. They awoke trembling, their voices urgent, insisting that flames would consume the parish within days. Their cries unsettled even their father, who dismissed most visions as misfortune but could not ignore the terror etched on their faces. Word spread, and soon the entire village lived under the shadow of anticipated disaster. Families doused their hearths early, buckets of water kept by doorways. Church bells rang prayers of protection. But no fire came. The days passed uneventfully, leaving many to whisper that perhaps the girls had lied at last. That false prophecy deepened the rift. Some villagers said it proved the sisters were frauds, or worse, demons who mocked the faithful with empty warnings. Others claimed the prayers of the parish had held the fire at bay, and that the girls' dreams had been genuine but thwarted by holy intervention. For the family, it mattered little. Trust was broken. Invitations dwindled, trade grew thin, and the once bustling support of neighbors turned to suspicion. The twins responded by withdrawing further. They spent weeks without stepping beyond their threshold, months without attending church. The parish that once pitied them now saw their absence as defiance. The minister condemned them subtly in sermons, warning against families who harbored darkness and denied the light of fellowship. The parents sat in silence, hearing reports of these words from neighbors, knowing they no longer dared show their faces in the pews. Isolation bred fragility. With no company but each other, the sisters' whispers grew stranger. Their mother swore that she sometimes heard them speak not in English or Scots but in tones she could not recognize, rhythmic and low, as if chanting in a forgotten tongue. Once, in the dead of night, she claimed she awoke to find them both sitting upright, eyes closed, moving their lips in perfect unison. She did not interrupt them but sat trembling in the shadows until exhaustion forced her back to restless sleep. By the late 1840s, their health had worsened. Fevers came frequently. Their limbs grew thin, their breaths shallow. Each illness threatened to carry them away, and yet they lingered, clinging to life with unnerving persistence. Some villagers said it was their curse, that they could not die until they fulfilled whatever dark task the devil had set upon them. Others argued they were protected by angels, preserved for a purpose no man could yet understand. To the parents, these speculations meant nothing. They lived only with the daily fear of losing both daughters at once, for the bond of their bodies meant that death, when it came, would take them together. The collapse was not sudden but gradual, like the crumbling of a wall brick by brick. The family no longer celebrated feast days. They no longer welcomed neighbors for harvest gatherings. Silence thickened the air of their home until even the ticking of a clock seemed intrusive. The girls' world narrowed to their shared bed, their whispered dreams, and the ever-present dread that surrounded them. And yet, in the quiet of isolation, their bond deepened. While the outside world turned away, they leaned into one another more fiercely. Their hands intertwined even in sleep, their breaths falling in rhythm. They shared smiles that others rarely saw, faint but unmistakable. For them, the world was reduced to two minds, two voices, bound by both flesh and fate. By the time the decade closed, the twins had become phantoms in their own parish. Few remembered their laughter as children, fewer still had courage to approach their home. Those who did claimed that the air around the cottage felt heavy, as if charged with unseen weight. Dogs refused to pass by, children crossed themselves, and travelers quickened their pace. The cottage, once just another dwelling on the moor, had become a silent monument to dread. Thus the collapse was complete, not with flames or storms, but with silence. A silence heavier than any noise, broken only by the whispers of the twins, who dreamt together in the dark while the world beyond their walls moved on without them. By the early 1850s, the story of the Conjoined sisters had largely faded from the minds of outsiders. New scandals, new tragedies, and the restless turning of decades carried attention elsewhere. Yet within the boundaries of the small parish, their presence remained an open wound that refused to close. The twins, though fragile, lingered on. Their bodies grew weaker, their gazes more distant, but death did not come swiftly. To the villagers, this endurance was unsettling. It seemed unnatural, almost defiant, that two frail young women, born of such difficult circumstance, should cling to life when healthier souls perished each winter from fever or hunger. Some whispered that their continued survival was proof that they were sustained by forces not of this earth. Others muttered that their lives had become punishment, both to themselves and to those around them, a long penance that could never be completed. Neighbors stopped speaking of them directly. If the subject arose, it was only in lowered voices, half-muttered, as if naming them aloud might invite misfortune. The cottage became invisible in plain sight, villagers passed it daily on their way to fields or church, but their eyes slid over it, never lingering. Children were warned not to stare at the shuttered windows. To call attention to the house was to tempt ill fate. Silence, then, became the only acceptable response. Within the family, silence thickened to suffocation. The father, worn down by years of bitterness, spoke little and drank more. His presence grew shadowy, almost spectral, a man resigned to the collapse of everything he had once hoped for. The mother, gaunt and weary, kept the home together with quiet devotion, though even she seemed reduced to ritual rather than hope. Her hands moved through daily tasks as if guided not by will but by habit, as though she were keeping the house alive in the same way one keeps a dying flame from flickering out completely. The sisters themselves drifted further into their dream world. They rarely acknowledged visitors, and when they did, their words were brief and strange. There were reports, second-hand, always, that when pressed about their visions, they offered answers so cryptic they sounded like riddles. "We have already seen the end," one was said to murmur. "The rest is only shadow." Whether these words were truly spoken, or whether gossip embroidered them, no one could be certain. Yet the rumors deepened the air of unease, and the family's isolation grew absolute. Over time, their absence from community life became normalized. The parish continued its festivals, its markets, its weddings and funerals, but the family was no longer expected to appear. Their names were omitted from rosters, their presence unremarked in gatherings. The silence surrounding them became a kind of agreement. To forget them publicly was to ensure the community's peace. To remember them aloud was to stir a ghost best left undisturbed. Still, memory has a way of lingering even when words do not. Children dared each other to run to the edge of the cottage fence, to touch the gate and return without being caught. They whispered that if you pressed your ear to the door, you could hear voices not just of the twins but of others, men, women, even cries of infants long dead. These were the inventions of youthful imagination, yet they clung stubbornly to the legend, fueling the sense that the cottage was no longer an ordinary home but a place suspended between the living and the dead. In time, a slow erosion set in. The father passed away first, leaving behind little more than debts and a hollow reputation. The villagers, though reluctant, performed the rites, burying him in the churchyard without mention of his daughters. His absence reduced the household further, and the mother became both guardian and prisoner, tied to the cottage by devotion and despair. She seldom left, and when she did, it was only to fetch water or bread, her eyes downcast, her body hunched as if braced against unseen weight. The girls, meanwhile, slipped deeper into obscurity. By their third decade of life, they were seldom glimpsed at all. When the doctor visited on rare occasions, he found them pale and silent, staring with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at him. Their bodies had grown almost immobile, their strength sapped, yet their bond endured. Even in weakness, their hands remained linked, their breaths rising and falling in unison as though time itself could not sever their rhythm. The parish spoke of them less and less, until their existence became a half-forgotten shadow, a story older folk recalled with unease but seldom retold in detail. For younger generations, they became little more than rumor, woven into cautionary tales. Parents warned children not to stray too close to the cottage at dusk. Lovers walking the lanes whispered that if you paused too near, you might hear voices calling your name in tones not your own. When at last the mother died, the parish faced an unspoken dilemma. Who would tend to the sisters? Some suggested placing them in an institution, far away from the moors, but no arrangements had been made, and no relatives claimed responsibility. For a brief period, neighbors brought food to the doorstep, leaving it without knocking. Yet even these gestures dwindled. The sisters were no longer figures of pity but of unease, and few wished to prolong contact. By the time the century neared its close, their story had become more myth than fact. Some claimed both sisters had died and been buried secretly by the parish. Others whispered they still lived, hidden away, refusing to be seen. No record was clear, no account certain. The silence of the parish preserved the ambiguity, a deliberate forgetting that blurred the line between history and legend. Thus, the aftermath was not marked by resolution but by erasure. The parish moved forward, its rhythms intact, its prayers unbroken, yet within its silence lingered a space that could not be filled. The cottage remained, weathered and grey, a monument not to death but to neglect, to the slow burial of memory beneath the weight of deliberate silence. And in that silence, the twins lived on, whether in truth or only in rumor, no one could say. But their whispers remained, carried in the minds of those who had once heard them, an echo that refused to fade, a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, never wholly disappears. The story of the conjoined twins who spoke only in dreams lingers as a puzzle, a fragment of history suspended between myth and reality. Scholars, villagers, and distant observers have long debated the meaning of their lives and the nature of their abilities. What, if anything, can be concluded from decades of whispers, visions, and elusive coincidences? The truth, as so often, remains just beyond reach. Some have suggested that the twins were simply a rare physiological anomaly whose shared body created a unique neurological connection. The overlapping nervous systems, some theorists argue, may have allowed subtle signals to pass between them during sleep, producing the uncanny effect of synchronized dreams. Their predictive accounts, then, could be interpreted as coincidence amplified by confirmation bias, the human tendency to remember what aligns with expectation while discarding what does not. Under this framework, there is no supernatural element, only the extraordinary interaction of nature, circumstance, and imagination. Yet even the most rigorous scientific minds struggle to account for the accuracy and consistency of the twins' visions. They spoke of events that were not merely probable but highly specific, details that could not easily have been anticipated. The death of the shepherd, the collapsing roof, the precise circumstances of the river accident, all occurred in ways that seemed to defy ordinary explanation. Those who witnessed these predictions, whether family or neighbors, were struck not by the novelty of dreaming but by the conviction with which the twins conveyed what would come to pass. Their dreams were not vague omens but vivid, meticulously detailed accounts. Philosophers and psychologists have considered a different angle, that the twins' shared consciousness might have been a form of extrasensory perception. In the 19th century, mesmerists and spiritualists would have called it clairvoyance. Modern theorists speculate that extreme neurological attunement between the sisters might have heightened their sensitivity to environmental cues, subtle patterns, or even unconscious knowledge of human behavior. If true, their abilities would be less magical than extraordinary, a product of observation, instinct, and an almost impossible alignment of perception. Still, the parish memories refused to be fully rationalized. For many villagers, the twins' presence was experienced as a disruption of ordinary reality, a bending of the familiar into something uncanny. Accounts of whispered dreams that prefigured calamity, of voices heard through shuttered walls, and of shadows that seemed to move with their will created a narrative of terror and awe that science alone cannot erase. These testimonies, however anecdotal, form a historical record of fear and fascination, demonstrating how communities interpret the inexplicable. Religious interpretations were equally persistent. Reverend Hume and others of his era framed the twins' abilities as a moral and spiritual challenge. Were they touched by God, the devil, or neither? Was their gift a test for the faithful, a warning of human frailty, or a manifestation of sin? The ambiguity of their lives, combined with the mystery of their dreams, made such questions unanswerable. Yet they were asked repeatedly, in sermons and private conversations, shaping the collective memory of the parish for generations. Some modern historians view the twins' story as a lens through which to examine societal attitudes toward difference, disability, and female agency. Conjoined, fragile, and silent by day, they became objects of both fear and fascination. Their lives were constrained by parental concern, medical curiosity, and public superstition. The very mystery that made them legendary also isolated them, demonstrating how communities respond to those who cannot be easily understood or controlled. Their isolation was both a cause and a consequence of the legend that enveloped them. The ambiguity of the record adds layers to the mystery. Official documents are scarce. Parish records note births, occasional illnesses, and the deaths of family members, but the twins themselves are often absent, reduced to numbers and initials. Letters from physicians and visiting scholars exist, but their accounts vary, sometimes contradicting one another, offering observation without conclusion. Oral histories provide richness but are inevitably colored by time, fear, and imagination. The twin whispers, so central to their story, cannot be captured in writing, leaving the most critical evidence always one step beyond reach. Even in death, or at least in the presumed absence of the twins, questions persist. Did they die quietly, unknown to all but a few, or did one survive the other? Were they buried with care or lost to a makeshift grave on the moors? Local folklore offers multiple versions. Some claim the sisters vanished without record, others that their spirits continue to wander the edges of the village, whispering warnings to the living. These accounts, whether true or imagined, ensure that the twins' story remains unresolved, perpetually teetering between fact and legend. The twins' dreams themselves are a final enigma. Were they prophetic, neurological, or purely imaginative? Could a shared mind, joined in flesh, truly extend perception beyond ordinary limits, or were their visions the product of coincidence and expectation, amplified by human credulity? The lack of contemporaneous verification beyond anecdote ensures that any definitive answer is impossible. Scholars can hypothesize, physicians can measure, and historians can analyze, but none can penetrate the interiority of those whispered nights, the intimate bond through which the twins navigated the invisible. What endures is the echo of their presence, the lingering impression left on a parish that could not fully understand them. Stories of the twins persisted for decades, whispered by old men to grandchildren, embedded in the architecture of fear and fascination. The cottage on the moor, shuttered and silent, became a monument not to horror but to mystery itself, a place where science, superstition, and human imagination intersected in ways that left no clear resolution. In the final assessment, the conjoined twins of 1832 Scotland remain a testament to the unknown. They challenge assumptions about mind and body, about the limits of perception, and about the boundaries between the natural and supernatural. Their story is an invitation to reflect on the fragility of certainty and the endurance of mystery. In every account, whether skeptical or credulous, their whispers continue to resonate, through time, through retelling, and through the lingering sense that some truths may exist only in the dim space between dream and waking. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, historians and curious minds alike grapple with the implications of their lives. Were they miracle or misperception? Gifted or cursed? The questions have no definitive answers, yet the fascination endures. And perhaps, in the deepest shadows of the moor where the twins once lived, some trace of their whispers still remains, a reminder that history does not always offer closure, and that some mysteries are meant to linger, haunting the edge of understanding, forever just out of reach. Long after the conjoined twins' lives had faded from living memory, their presence persisted in the subtle, unspoken currents of the parish. Houses built after their time seemed to carry an invisible weight. Children grew up hearing the faint echoes of whispers, even if no adult spoke of the twins directly. The cottage where they once slept remained, weathered and gray, its shutters perpetually drawn, a monument to both absence and endurance. Though the twins were no longer seen, the stories they left behind shaped the village for generations, embedding a quiet unease into the landscape itself. The twins' influence on local folklore was profound. Parents told cautionary tales to children, warning them not to ignore dreams or dismiss the warnings of others, even when cloaked in innocence. It was said that if one approached the abandoned cottage at night, the air would thicken, and faint murmurs might brush against the ears, a lingering echo of the sisters' shared consciousness. Some claimed that these whispers were warnings of personal danger, while others maintained they were remnants of the girls' dreams, preserved in the fabric of the building itself. This duality between fear and fascination defined their posthumous legacy. Scholars who revisited the story in the decades following the twins' disappearance found the evidence frustratingly incomplete. Parish records documented births, deaths, and occasional illnesses, but the twins themselves were almost entirely absent, reduced to initials or numbers. Physicians' notes, often written in meticulous, cold detail, described measurements and observations but offered no insight into the essence of the girls' experiences. Visitors' memoirs were scattered, sometimes contradictory, reflecting the observer's own fears, expectations, and biases. The mystery, therefore, was preserved not by deliberate deception but by the intrinsic limits of observation and record-keeping. Modern interpretations have sought to reconcile the extraordinary with the plausible. Some theorists suggest that the twins' shared physiology may have allowed for unprecedented neurological synchronization, producing synchronized dreams that were interpreted as premonitions. Others argue for a more psychological reading. The girls' shared experience magnified ordinary intuition and perception, which, when filtered through the lens of fear and expectation, appeared prophetic. Yet no scientific explanation fully accounts for the precise correlations between their dreams and the real-world events recorded in the parish. The enigma remains, precisely because it resists definitive categorization. Beyond scientific inquiry, the twins' story has been examined as a commentary on human response to difference. Their conjoined condition, their unique abilities, and their isolation highlight societal attitudes toward anomaly and disability. In life, they were objects of both fascination and fear. In death, they became symbols of what communities choose to remember and what they seek to forget. Their existence challenged ordinary expectations, exposing the fragility of perception and the limits of communal understanding. The parish's treatment of them illustrates how social norms and superstition can compound isolation, leaving the most vulnerable both visible and invisible simultaneously. The emotional legacy is equally compelling. Descendants of those who lived alongside the twins recall the atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. Tales of whispered warnings, premonitions, and sudden accidents persisted well into the late 19th century. These stories were not always literal. Often, they were refracted through generations of memory, each retelling layering new interpretation atop old fear. Yet the emotional resonance remained, a sense that the village had been touched by something extraordinary, and that ordinary life had been irrevocably altered. Local topography absorbed the tale as well. The moors, hills, and riverbanks surrounding the cottage became spaces of implicit caution. Travelers and shepherds avoided lingering too long near the old house, even after the last family members had passed. Paths once walked freely now carried an unspoken tension, and certain trees, rocks, or bends in the stream were named in whispered reference to the twins' presence. Landscape, memory, and superstition intertwined to preserve the echo of their existence in a tangible form, reinforcing the idea that some histories leave footprints that endure beyond the lifespan of their subjects. In literature and scholarly work, the twins have become archetypal figures, emblematic of the tension between the known and the unknowable. Writers have drawn upon their story to explore themes of duality, isolation, and the intersection of human perception and supernatural possibility. Conjoined in body, yet distinct in mind, the girls embody contradictions that challenge narrative closure. Their whispers, the synchrony of their sleep, and their uncanny foresight offer a lens through which authors and historians alike examine the boundaries of reality, imagination, and interpretation. The lingering legacy also raises philosophical questions. What does it mean to experience reality collectively, as the twins did? If their shared dreams were a form of consciousness beyond ordinary perception, does that challenge the conventional understanding of self and individuality? Could such a bond exist elsewhere, unnoticed and unrecorded, among other individuals? These questions, inherently unanswerable, provide a haunting resonance to their story. In every account, the twins remain at once intimate and unknowable, both fully human and profoundly mysterious. Perhaps most unsettling is the notion that their influence persists precisely because it defies resolution. Unlike typical historical figures, whose lives can be documented, analyzed, and summarized, the twins' existence resists finality. Each retelling uncovers new uncertainties, new interpretations, and new questions. Their story is a living artifact, reshaped by memory, speculation, and imagination. In this way, the twins continue to speak, long after their mortal presence has ended, not in audible words but in the emotional and intellectual imprint they left on all who encountered them. Even today, the cottage on the moor stands as a testament to what is unresolvable. Its weathered walls, shuttered windows, and overgrown gardens serve as silent witnesses to decades of whispered dreams, observed phenomena, and unrecorded truths. Visitors report a peculiar stillness in the air, a sense of being watched or felt rather than seen. Scholars, folklorists, and casual wanderers alike sense the lingering resonance of the twins' presence. Whether this is psychological projection or a genuine trace of extraordinary human experience is left for each observer to determine. Ultimately, the story of the twins is not simply a narrative of physiological anomaly or prophetic dreams. It is a meditation on human perception, community, and the enduring power of mystery. They compel us to question what we know, what we assume, and what we fear. Their whispers, their synchronized visions, and the shadows they left behind challenge us to consider how the extraordinary manifests in ordinary lives, and how ordinary people respond to what cannot be fully explained. In the absence of definitive answers, the twins' legacy remains intact, a haunting presence bridging past and present. Historians continue to debate, villagers still recount fragments, and the moors, windswept and grey, hold the memory of a bond that was never fully comprehended. It is in this unresolved tension, this perpetual edge between understanding and ignorance, that the conjoined twins' story endures. Their lives, dreams, and whispers form a monument not to certainty but to the enigmatic, an invitation for every generation to confront what cannot be neatly categorized, explained, or contained.